May 1940. The world was witnessing the impossible. Germany's blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had ripped through Allied defenses with a speed that defied every lesson learned from the trenches of the last war. In mere weeks, armies collapsed, nations fell, and now the true cost of this sudden, violent conquest was being calculated on a tiny, fog-strewn stretch of French coastline. Here, against the English Channel, over 400,000 British, French, and Belgian soldiers found themselves trapped, pinned, surrounded, outnumbered. Their backs were literally to the sea. The situation was not defeat, it was annihilation. The spearhead of this collapse was the Panzer Division, Hitler's revolutionary armored corps. Led by men like Heinz Guderian, they had executed a brilliant gamble. Punching through the supposedly impassable forests of the Ardennes, they bypassed the static French defenses of the Maginot Line entirely. The Allied forces, the highly trained British Expeditionary Force among them, had marched confidently into Belgium, straight into the intended German trap. The Panzers then raced to the sea, reaching Abbeville on May 20th, cutting the entire Allied force in two. It was a strategic decapitation. By May 23rd, the German armored columns were not hours, but moments away from encircling the last desperate pocket of Allied resistance. This was not a battle they were winning, it was a siege they were about to conclude. The entire British Expeditionary Force, the only body of trained professional soldiers Britain possessed, was in the German grasp. Had they been captured, Britain would have lost the capacity to fight on, forcing an immediate humiliating peace. The Second World War would have ended here, on the beaches of northern France. The tension within the German High Command was not over if they would win, but how they would win. Some generals argued for a final crushing armored assault. Others, including the panzer commanders who had driven non-stop for 10 days, pleaded for a pause. Their tanks were battered, their supply lines were stretched thinner than piano wire, and their troops were exhausted. But the objective was clear: Dunkirk, the last functional port. The German armies were less than 10 miles away from the target. The beaches were undefended. The final victory was literally in sight. And then, on the morning of May 24th, 1940, the impossible happened. The man who had thrown all caution to the wind, the man who had ordered the most audacious advance in military history, the man who stood on the cusp of conquering Western Europe, ordered them to stop. For 72 crucial hours, 3 full days, the most formidable military machine on the planet stood still. The German armored divisions were paralyzed. Their commanders raged, begged, and even briefly ignored the order, but it was enforced from the highest levels. This incomprehensible pause lasted from the evening of May 24th until the night of May 26th. It was a gift of time, a reprieve the Allies had no right to expect. It was a window of salvation that historian Basil Littlehart would later call the most significant mistake of the entire war. Why? Why did Adolf Hitler, with a continent at his feet, voluntarily pull his punch? Was this a tactical masterstroke designed to preserve his tanks? Was it a calculated political gesture to a nation he secretly admired? Or was it, as some generals whispered, the first fatal failure of nerve from a man who was fundamentally a corporal out of his depth? This is the story of that 72-hour blunder, the moment Hitler exchanged certain victory for enduring global conflict, and the reason a few 100,000 men lived to fight another day. To understand the most critical operational blunder of the war, we must enter the tense, suffocating world of the German High Command in May 1940. The order did not appear out of thin air. It was the culmination of 3 powerful competing forces: tactical caution, political hubris, and personal ambition, all colliding in the wake of an overwhelming victory. There are essentially three major theses historians still debate: the cautionary pause, the Luftwaffe's hubris, and the political golden bridge. The first and most accepted theory comes from the Wehrmacht generals themselves, rooted in a deep-seated fear of overextension. The Panzer divisions had advanced nearly 250 miles in 10 days. They were a mailed fist, yes, but a fist detached from the body. Their supporting infantry, artillery, and critically, their supply trucks were struggling hundreds of miles behind. The tanks were running on fumes, and the tracks were worn out. General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, was the first high-ranking officer to issue an order to pause, seeking to consolidate his dangerously stretched forces. But this caution was given a specific, chilling edge by one small but effective counterattack. On May 21st, 2 days before the halt, the British launched a limited armored counterstrike near the town of Arras. It involved less than 100 Allied tanks, but it hit the flank of Major General Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, catching them completely by surprise. The attack was repelled, but the damage was done, not to the German divisions, but to the German nerve. Rommel, always prone to exaggeration, reported being attacked by hundreds of tanks. This confirmed the deepest fears of the more cautious German generals. Their flanks were vulnerable to a major Allied counterstroke, one that could cut the thin Panzer corridor and strand them. Hitler, an amateur strategist who had long been suspicious of his aristocratic generals, was oddly influenced by this panic. He feared risking his most valuable assets, the Panzers, in the complex, marshy, canal-riddled terrain surrounding Dunkirk, terrain he knew intimately from fighting in Flanders during World War I. He decided the infantry, which was finally catching up, should handle the mop-up operation, leaving the tanks fresh for the coming offensive against the rest of France, case red. This tactical caution provided the perfect opening for the second and arguably most influential reason for the halt: the towering vanity of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe. Göring, the second most powerful man in the Reich, and desperate for a grand solo victory, assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could finish the job alone. He argued that committing tanks would only churn the beaches, making them harder for the infantry to cross later. Instead, his air force, the Stukas and bombers, would rain down hell, turning the entire Dunkirk pocket into an unmanageable inferno and forcing the surrender of the trapped Allies. Göring was eager to prove the Luftwaffe's decisive strategic power and consolidate his own political standing, which had been steadily eroded by the army's spectacular success. Hitler, whose faith in air power was immense, agreed. He issued Directive No. 13, confirming the halt and delegating the destruction of the trapped enemy to the Air Force. This decision was fatal. It fundamentally underestimated the tenacity of the Royal Air Force, which, flying short sorties from bases just across the Channel, provided crucial air cover. It also disastrously relied on the notoriously unreliable late May weather over the Channel, which soon brought heavy clouds and fog, grounding the Luftwaffe and giving the Allies essential breathing room. The third theory is the most bizarre and ultimately the least credible, but remains the most tantalizing: the idea that Hitler deliberately let the British escape to force a political peace. Propagated heavily by Hitler himself in later years and seized upon by some German generals after the war to shift blame, the theory suggests Hitler admired the British Empire and wanted to avoid its utter destruction. He allegedly saw Britain as a natural racial ally against the Soviet Union. By sparing the BEF and avoiding total humiliation, he hoped to provide Britain with a golden bridge, an honorable way out, paving the way for a negotiated peace that would allow him to turn his entire attention eastward. However, historical evidence directly contradicts this. Directive Number 13 explicitly ordered the elimination of the French, English, and Belgian forces in the enclave. The subsequent actions of the Luftwaffe, which relentlessly bombed the beaches and shipping, were clearly intended for destruction, not diplomacy. If Hitler truly wanted a compromise peace, allowing the BEF to be destroyed would have given him maximum leverage. The consensus among historians points to a fatal combination of the first two theories: operational caution, amplified by the Arras counterattack, and cemented by Göring's ambitious overconfidence. Whatever the precise mixture of motive, the result was a catastrophe for Germany. The 3 days were priceless. They allowed the Royal Navy and the improvised flotilla of civilian little ships to organize Operation Dynamo. They allowed the Allied troops to establish a defensive perimeter, transforming the chaotic beach into a formidable, if temporary, fortress. When the tanks finally resumed their advance on May 27th, the ground was no longer clear. They were met not by fleeing mobs, but by fierce, disciplined resistance, bought by the French rearguard who sacrificed themselves heroically. In those 72 hours, Hitler saved his tanks, but he lost his chance to end the war in 1940. He unknowingly preserved the core of the British Army, guaranteeing that Britain would remain in the fight. As the German Panzers sat idle, locked down by Hitler's controversial order, a desperate, improvised rescue operation was already underway. This was Operation Dynamo. Initially, the goal was modest: salvage perhaps 45,000 professional soldiers. But as the clock ticked through the 72-hour reprieve, the operation swelled far beyond military planning. The Royal Navy, overwhelmed, called upon the public, and the public answered. Across the English Channel, hundreds of civilian craft, fishing boats, yachts, lifeboats, paddle steamers, pleasure cruisers were commandeered or volunteered. These were the legendary little ships of Dunkirk. They were crewed by fishermen, sailors, and amateurs sailing into a war zone, risking Stuka dive bombers and E-boats to ferry men from the shallow beaches where the larger destroyers could not reach. Yet the miracle of the evacuation would have been impossible without the relentless sacrifice of the French First Army and the rearguard British units. While 340,000 men waited to be evacuated, a small, highly determined force, often fighting street to street in the ruins of Dunkirk, held the shrinking perimeter. Led by General René Preux and others, these soldiers fought continuously, facing the full might of the German infantry and the renewed terror of the Luftwaffe, which, when the weather finally cleared, hammered the beaches and the town mercilessly. They fought to the last bullet, fulfilling the most brutal of military duties, buying time for their comrades to escape. When the last British destroyer, the Shikari, pulled away on June 4th, over 338,000 Allied soldiers, more than 7 times the initial estimate, had been saved. The equipment was lost: some 68,000 vehicles, 2,500 guns, and enough rifles to arm 10 divisions lay abandoned. But the men, the veterans, were safe. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister just weeks before the invasion, tempered the mood. He knew the rescue was not a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, he reminded the nation. But the return of the BEF provided more than just manpower. It provided a psychological lifeline. The British people, facing the certainty of invasion, saw the successful evacuation not as a defeat, but as a triumph of will and unity. This morale boost was priceless, hardening the national resolve. Crucially, the return of the BEF was the physical guarantee that Britain would not negotiate with Hitler.
Had those 338,000 men been captured, Churchill would have been politically defenseless, facing immense pressure to strike a deal with Germany. By allowing them to escape, Hitler stripped himself of his most powerful bargaining chip. The 72-hour blunder was the pivot upon which the entire course of the war turned. Hitler did conquer the rest of France a few weeks later. He did execute Case Red. But Britain remained defiant, forcing Hitler to initiate the Battle of Britain, the first time the German war machine was fully stopped. More importantly, Britain's continued survival meant the United States, through the Lend-Lease Act, had a secure, sovereign base from which to project its industrial power. By 1944, those preserved veterans from Dunkirk formed the nucleus of the army that stormed the beaches of Normandy. In saving his tanks from a marshy battlefield, Hitler doomed Germany to the very thing he sought to avoid: a prolonged global war against an industrial superpower. The man who sought to destroy the British Empire with a snap of his fingers merely gave it 3 days to live. Those 72 hours were not a pause. They were the fatal error that ensured the eventual defeat of the Third Reich.
We began with a paradox: how the most powerful army in the world, on the verge of total victory, simply stopped. The truth, as we've explored, wasn't a grand single intention, but a confluence of human failings. The operational anxiety of commanders like Rundstedt fearing a counterpunch, the personal ambition of Göring demanding an air-only victory, and Hitler's own overconfidence in the inevitability of British surrender. In those 72 hours, the German leadership was arguing over how to claim the victory. Meanwhile, on the beaches, the British were quietly building the foundations of their survival. This was the profound significance of the blunder. It wasn't just that the Panzers stopped. It was that Hitler chose the worst possible alternative for German victory. Had he ordered the tanks forward, the entire BEF would have been captured, and Britain's will to fight would likely have been extinguished through political necessity. Had he truly wanted a golden bridge, he would have simply allowed the evacuation without the air bombardment. Instead, his order provided a window for escape while simultaneously infuriating the British with relentless air attack, thus solidifying their resolve. The ripple effects were immediate and devastating to the Reich. The escaped soldiers formed the backbone of the army that stood firm during the Battle of Britain. When they returned to France 4 years later on D-Day, they brought with them the military experience and the national memory of Dunkirk. The 72-hour blunder was therefore not just a historical footnote. It was the crucible moment that prevented a swift end to the war in 1940 and guaranteed the intervention of the United States. It allowed the flame of resistance to burn. It provided the world with its first modern miracle, and it stands as the clearest evidence that even in moments of seemingly unstoppable power, a single flawed decision at the highest level can determine the fate of nations and the course of history itself.